Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to Jane Austen July. Today is the first day of Jane Austen July, and I'm going to be talking through 10 reasons why you should read or reread Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. So if you are new here and you don't know what Jane Austen July is, I'll leave some more links down below with information, but it is a month-long readathon that takes place every July, all about celebrating Jane Austen. And our group read this year is Mansfield Park, and so I wanted to take today to talk about Mansfield Park and the reasons why I love it, why I think it's worth reading, why I think it's worth rereading if you didn't necessarily love it the first time you read it. Mansfield Park is a less loved Austen, shall we say. I think it is many people's least favourite Austen, and I think that means that it can feel a bit daunting going into it. And I also think there are many people who, the first time they read Mansfield Park, didn't love it, or it wasn't quite what they were hoping it would be, and therefore they sort of had a negative experience with it. But I do think it's a novel that can really improve on a reread, or if you go into it with slightly different expectations. So I guess today, as Mansfield Park is our group read this year, I wanted to encourage you to give it a try, or to give it another try if you have read it before and weren't so sure about it. I know that the first time I personally read Mansfield Park, it wasn't my favourite Austen. The first time I read it, I felt a bit disappointed by the quieter heroine and the fact that it didn't really give me the love story I was looking for from Jane Austen when I was a teenager and when I first read this. But having read it and reread it many, many times over the years, and having studied it at university, I now love it very, very much. It is my second favourite Jane Austen after Pride and Prejudice, and it's sort of very close to Pride and Prejudice in my love for it. I think it's an incredible novel and a really, really interesting one, and I think if you go into it not looking for a love story but looking for some other things, then you might get a lot out of it. It is a story of Fanny Price, a young woman from a sort of middle-class, lower middle-class background, who ends up moving from her parents' home to live with her wealthy, upper-class aunt and uncle and their children. She sort of grows up with them from the age of about 10 or 11, and then we mostly follow her from the age of about 18, and what happens when everything is disrupted by the arrival of two new people in the neighbourhood of Mansfield Park. So that's the basic premise, and now let me go through my 10 reasons why you should read or reread Mansfield Park. Reason number one to read Mansfield Park is for its somewhat different heroine. Fanny Price is a much quieter, more introspective character than Austen heroines like Elizabeth Bennet or Emma Woodhouse. But personally, I really love Fanny Price because I think she is a really rich, powerful character. Fanny Price is much quieter. She finds her life quite difficult and is often quite unhappy and lonely, and I think that is written about wonderfully. She, at a first glance, may look like a meek character, but there are moments where she really stands up for herself, and she does have a really strong sense of her own opinions and her own beliefs and wants and what she wants from life. Many of Jane Austen's heroines go on a interesting character arc in which, you know, we see them learn lessons, but Fanny Price kind of doesn't need to because she's just always great, and I really enjoy her quiet strength. I found it really interesting over the last few years, and especially over the last few months, to see everyone very, very excited about The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling all about Mary Bennet, and then there's recently been an adaptation, and I always find it interesting hearing people talk about how much they love the character of Mary Bennet in The Other Bennet Sister, because Jane Austen already wrote a character quite like that, and that's Fanny Price. Like, I think Fanny Price has a lot in common with Mary Bennet. You know, Fanny Price is that quiet, slightly socially awkward, timid character, and I love her very, very much. However, if you don't like Fanny Price, then read Mansfield Park for the Crawfords. Henry and Mary Crawford are a brother and sister who turn up in the neighbourhood of Mansfield Park and disrupt everything quite near the beginning of the book. They are witty and careless and rather scandalous, and very funny and engaging, and I love them as characters. They are both really, really fascinating, rich characters who are very layered and flawed and complicated, but never in a sort of straightforward way. And I really think they are two of Jane Austen's most wonderful creations, and they are just fascinating to read about throughout Mansfield Park. Reason number 3 is that Mansfield Park is a novel with a lot of scandal and drama and really, really messy family dynamics. Like, there is a lot of drama in Mansfield Park, and there is like some truly terrible parenting, and I really enjoy all the chaos and dysfunction within the Bertram family, who are the family Fanny has gone to live with. I think it's absolutely fascinating and something that makes Mansfield Park really, really rich and engaging. Obviously, Jane Austen often writes about messy family dynamics and bad parenting, but I feel like the Bertrams are a particularly dysfunctional family with just lots of people who are dislikable in lots of different ways, and I really, really enjoy that about Mansfield Park, and I think the Bertrams are just a fascinating set of characters. My 4th reason why you should read Mansfield Park is that it is a really powerful, marvellous novel about unrequited love. Now, you do have to get past the fact that the man Fanny is in unrequited love with is her first cousin. I read a lot of novels set in the 19th century where that was just really normal, so I am very used to people being in love with their cousins in a fictional setting. But I do understand that for some modern readers, and especially people who are sort of mostly going to Jane Austen for the love stories, that can be an off-putting element of Mansfield Park. But, you know, it's a book from the early 19th century. That was how things were then. And leaving that aside, I do think Mansfield Park is a really powerful novel about unrequited love and about the loneliness and sorrow of unrequited love. I think many people find Mansfield Park disappointing as a love story. And I think, like, as a whole love story, like, I don't think that is what Mansfield Park is trying to do. I don't think it's trying to be a conventional love story. I don't think it is as much a love story as several other Jane Austen novels. I made a video quite a few Jane Austen Julys ago talking about like which Jane Austen novels I think are love stories and which I think are predominantly something else. So I'll leave that link down below. And I don't think Mansfield Park is predominantly a love story. I think there's many, many other things going on that are more important. But I do think it is a book that is about unrequited love. That is a very, very big theme. That's a theme that's at the heart of Mansfield Park, and I really love the way it is explored. Reason number 5 why you should read Mansfield Park is for its social criticism. Mansfield Park is a novel with hugely rich themes and really, really interesting social criticism. And I think in many ways it's a much more interesting novel to read as a work of social critique than a love story. As I said, I don't think that Mansfield Park is predominantly trying to be a love story. I don't think that's its main focus, which I think for people who love that in Jane Austen, that is why it ends up being less of a favourite. But I think the social critique and the way it explores society, and not exactly slice of life, but the breaking down of this small community and all of the problems within it, I find that really, really interesting, and I like that a lot. Leading on from the social critique, my next few points are about the themes of Mansfield Park and what I love about them. So my 6th reason to read Mansfield Park is the way Mansfield Park looks at class. Fanny Price is Austen's lowest class heroine. She is basically a middle class girl living with upper class relatives. You know, she's often treated as lesser by the people around her because of her different class status, and her own feelings about her place within Mansfield Park and also about her own family are very, very complicated. And that's an element of Mansfield Park that I find very, very interesting. Fanny's sort of complicated class status and her position within this household is really interesting to read about. I also find it very interesting to think about in relation to Jane Austen's own family. Jane Austen was the daughter of a clergyman, so she was sort of technically upper class because clergymen are always gentlemen, but like they didn't have a masses of money, and so her social position is probably a bit above Fanny Price's, but not like as much above Fanny Price's. And a lot of the characters Jane Austen writes about in her novels are slightly sort of above her in the social scale. But Jane Austen's brother Edward was adopted by some wealthy relations, the Knights, and then he sort of became like proper gentry. And he, like Fanny, was taken to live with these wealthy relations when he was about 10 years old. So it's very hard to read Mansfield Park without thinking about the connections to Jane Austen's own family and her own brother being sent away from home to live with wealthy relations, and how that sort of changed his status in the world. So that kind of increased the interest I find in the way Mansfield Park looks at sort of class and social position, I suppose. Another really interesting theme in the novel is that of sort of outsiderness, I suppose, which kind of links in to the themes of oppression and loneliness within the novel, with the theme of being sort of both part of and not quite part of something. Fanny is and isn't part of the Bertram family. She lives there and she is educated with the Bertram daughters, and she is close friends with her cousin Edmund, but she is treated at times times like a servant by her Aunt Norris, and the times when her uncle Sir Thomas Bertram treats her like one of the family sort of shocks her and surprises her and confuses her. Her position within the family is really complicated. She's often treated like an outsider, and the way her Aunt Norris treats her is just despicable. Mrs. Norris is a fascinating character. She's just the worst, but is drawn in such a fantastic way. And I think that the way Mrs. Norris treats Fanny, and how Fanny is treated because of her background, is really, really interesting within Mansfield Park. One thing you often hear discussed in relation to Mansfield Park is that the book touches on slavery and the abolitionist movement within this point in time in the early 19th century. It is there, but it is a very small element of the book. In fact, I think another thing that often disappoints readers about Mansfield Park is they've heard this spoken about as though it's a big element of the book, and then it isn't really. Sir Thomas Bertram owns a plantation in Antigua. He owns slaves, and there is a passing mention of Fanny asking him about the slave trade, but what she asked him and what he said in response, we don't know. However, we do know that Fanny's favourite poet is William Cowper, who was very famously an abolitionist poet. So Mansfield Park is sort of lightly engaging in that debate, but it's not sort of fervently engaging in that debate, I would say. But I do think the fact that Sir Thomas Bertram owns a plantation in Antigua, and the fact that oppression is quite sort of a big theme within the novel is not a coincidence. So I feel like it's an interesting part of the novel, but also it's not as big a part of the novel as is sometimes said to be. If you want a novel that engages slightly more with the theme of slavery and with the abolitionist movement, then I would recommend Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. But also, you know, this is a video where I'm recommending you to read Mansfield Park. I'm just sort of also trying to explore some of the reasons why I think sometimes people are slightly disappointed by Mansfield Park. Anyway, I feel like I've gone on a tangent with that point. But my 8th reason to read Mansfield Park, another theme I love in it, is the theme of home. Many of Jane Austen's novels and many 19th century marriage plot novels are about searching for a partner in life. And Mansfield Park is a little bit about that, but I think it is really more about searching for a place to belong, searching for home. And the way Mansfield Park looks at place and belonging is something I really, really love. Fanny lives at Mansfield Park, and she loves the grounds and the nature and the beauty of the place, but she's also, you know, not quite part of the family, not quite belonging. And I feel like a lot of the novel is about her search for belonging and her trying to belong in a place. And I really, really enjoy the way Mansfield Park looks at home and place. I think it is wonderful. So that's another reason to read it. My 9th reason for you to read or reread Mansfield Park is that I think it is one of Jane Austen's richest, most complex novels. For me, I would say that Mansfield Park and Emma are the most complex Jane Austen novels. Like, they are the longest, they have a lot going on, they're dealing with a lot of things. You know, Pride and Prejudice is my favourite Jane Austen novel because it is the novel I find the most warm and enjoyable and lovely. You know, it's the biggest comfort read for me. But Mansfield Park is my second favourite Jane Austen novel because it's the Austen novel I find the most interesting. I just think it is fascinating because it's really rich and really complex. It has so many themes, so many interesting characters. Every character is so well drawn. The complexities of the themes are really interesting. There's also just a lot of things going on beneath the surface, and I really love the complexity of Mansfield Park, which kind of leads me on to my 10th and final reason why you should read Mansfield Park, and that is that it is really, really rereadable. I love rereading Mansfield Park because it is so complicated, because every time I read it, I learn something new and I discover something new. And it also is the Jane Austen novel that has like improved the most for me over time. Like I said, the first time I read it, I wasn't that fussed. I was like, this is a bit less exciting. I want more of a love story. I want, you know, more sparkle. And then I studied it at university and I read it another 2 times and I just thought, oh no, actually, this is fantastic. This is so interesting. This is so complicated. There's so many great things going on. And when I went into it not looking for a love story, but looking at it as a social critique novel, looking at all of its themes, looking at it as a coming-of-age story in many ways, looking at Fanny Price as a character, I just came to absolutely love it, and I have just reread it so many times since, and every time I just love it even more, and I spot new things, and I find it fascinating, and I love the characters, and I find it a hugely rich and rewarding novel to read. I highly, highly recommend reading Mansfield Park, and I highly recommend rereading it. If it's a book that you've read before and weren't sure about, if it was a while ago, maybe give it another try, because it truly is absolutely wonderful, and I can't recommend it enough. So there we go. Those are 10 reasons to read or to reread Mansfield Park. Do please let me know if you're joining in with the read along this year and what you think of Mansfield Park. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.